Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the virtual Reforestation Pipeline Workshop to improve operational outcomes in the Southwestern U.S. I'm Lauren Kramer. I'm an adaptation specialist with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. And then I just want to recognize the workshop planning team who has really had to work overtime to make this workshop happen, despite many setbacks and challenges, changes in format. And so I'm going to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves as they appear on the slide here today. So we'll start with Owen.
Hi, folks. I'm Owen Burney. I'm a professor at New Mexico State University and director of the John T. Harrington Forestry Research Center, located in Mora, New Mexico.
Hi, all. I'm Marin Chambers. I'm a research associate at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Nabil Kajeri. I'm the Western Nursery Specialist with the Forest Service. I'm based out of Region 6, and I live out of Portland. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I service 7 of the 9 Forest Service regions, including Region 3.
Hi, everyone. Rachel Foe, Director of the Southern Rockies region for American Forests, covers sort of the Four Corners area, and I'm based in Albuquerque.
And then I already introduced myself. Again, Lauren with the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, and I'll pass it to Jeremy.
Good morning, everybody. Jeremy Pinto with U.S. Forest Service. I am a team member on the Reforestation Nurseries and Genetic Resources group. And I work out of Region 3, but I serve nationally as the Tribal Nursery Specialist. And today I'm coming from Moscow, Idaho. It's good to be here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Vicini. I'm a research associate at Colorado State University. And in that role, I'm a climate adaptation specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. And I'm based out of Colorado.
Morning, everyone. I'm Joshua Sloan with New Mexico Highlands University, where I'm an associate professor of forestry and director of reforestation operations.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Get an idea of who's been part of this workshop and who's speaking today.
Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Some of you may know that before joining American Forests, I was the reforestation coordinator for the New Mexico Forestry Division. And in that role, I worked with partners to strategize reforestation efforts across the state. A key question we asked was, how do we achieve the ambitious reforestation goals outlined in the New Mexico Forest Action Plan? Part of the answer was the New Mexico Reforestation Center, which is a collaboration between the state and those university partners listed on the screen. And for those of you that don't know, the New Mexico Forestry Division is part of the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, and that's why there's MNERD on the screen. So it's easy to think of the New Mexico Reforestation Center as simply a nursery expansion. And while it's true that efforts are underway to scale the Mora Nursery to produce 5 million seedlings per year, the Reforestation Center was designed with a broader vision. Larger greenhouses alone will not ensure successful reforestation, especially in the increasingly harsh conditions of the Southwest. A more holistic approach is needed, one that strengthens the entire reforestation pipeline, from seed collection to outplanting and long-term monitoring. And as you can see on the slide, we sort of divvied up the expertise and the institutions responsible for each piece as part of this broader collaboration of the New Mexico Reforestation Center. So addressing these challenges is really complex because in our region, we have limited reforestation workforce, infrastructure, and capacity. The idea for this training today originated during my time with the New Mexico Forestry Division. And a special thanks to Lindsay Quam for initiating this effort and for connecting us with the Southwest Climate Hub, who's, through Lauren, been really helpful with coordination support. So initially, the planning team focused the training on outplanting, and because we recognized that this was a critical challenge for practitioners. But as we planned, it became clear that a broader understanding of the reforestation supply chain chain is essential. By grasping the full process from seed to planting, practitioners can better appreciate the resources invested in every seedling and make more informed decisions. That was our thinking. So because of this comprehensive approach, today's workshop covers a wide range of topics rather than going deeply into any particular one. And I'm told that each topic could be a course in and of itself. So we see this training as an introduction, and we're eager to hear back from you. What do you and your organization need, and what can we provide to help you make you more effective? So in my current role at American Forests, I focus on the reforestation pipeline challenges at a larger regional scale. And I'm thrilled to see such a diverse group of partners here today because reforestation success really depends on all of us. Strengthening our region's reforestation supply chain will not only improve outcomes, but will also support the work of every organization in the space. So thank you so much for being here and for your participation in crafting future trainings. And then just to kind of go over highlight our goals today. Obviously, we want to provide some practical skills or experience, and then some scientific expertise that touches on each one of those pipeline pieces. But we also want to hear back from you. We want to engage with you and see what you need so that will inform future trainings. And our agenda for the day, as you can see on the board, we'll start off with seed, and then we'll move into nursery, outplanting, and we'll get some feedback at the end with some next steps. So I will pass it to Josh to get us started.
Morning, everyone. Let me work the technology here and get a presentation pulled up. So quick outline of what I'm hoping to cover in my piece. And I recognize that, we have folks here from a pretty broad range of experience and expertise when it comes to reforestation and where folks have worked in the reforestation pipeline. So some of this, a lot of you might know, might feel really introductory, but hopefully there'll be something for everyone here, or at least reinforce a lot of the ways we should be thinking and things we should be considering about this. So just want to touch very briefly on the importance of seed and keeping that top of mind throughout our reforestation planning and operations. Want to just briefly introduce as concepts and a framework for our thinking, the reforestation pipeline that Rachel already introduced, and then the target plant concept that gives us a slightly more detailed problem-solving framework to think about. And then an overview of seed collection process practices, collection planning execution, and a little bit about the role of partners in this collection work, because as many of you probably know, have probably experienced, seed collection is complicated work. There's nothing easy or simple about it from planning through execution. But a lot of those challenges can be overcome with very intentional approaches to working with partners and figuring out how we can support each other in this work. And then we're going to wrap up with some discussion of some useful resources, references, and contacts for myself and my staff for anyone that might want to follow up on anything for work in the Southwest. Also, just as kind of quick breakdown on what we're expecting for timeline. Probably looking at another 20 minutes or so of presentation is probably the target here. And then probably 15-20 minutes of talking through some of the resources and some seed lot selection tool examples. And then we should have time for questions. But that's kind of the ballpark we're looking at for this section. And also just kind of a heads up, in presentation view, it makes it really difficult to see any questions in the chat or any hands that are up. So if I would ask maybe Lauren and Rachel, if you see anything in the chat, maybe flag me down if we need to.
Will do,
Thanks.
Josh.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So you're here, so I'm expecting everybody basically knows why this work is important. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here. But of course, regeneration is a critical aspect of forestry. It's one of the main phases, main bodies of practice within the field of silviculture and forest management. And practically all of that regeneration relies on seed. As we're shifting into climate regimes, as we're shifting into, sort of new times where we're seeing more natural regeneration failures, we're seeing increasing artificial regeneration failures. That is obviously really stressing our regeneration capacity and resources. So, we've got a lot of work to do here. And a lot of that, in my experience, falls in the seed area. And maybe it's because I'm really close to it in my work, but I feel like it's one of our weaker and less understood areas of the reforestation pipeline. And as we're talking about this, a couple of things I want to keep, or I guess highlight up front that we'll be coming back to. One thing that all of us should be thinking about a lot is seed inventory management and what those needs look like. We'll be discussing this at a couple of points, but we need to be thinking of that at a couple of levels, I would argue. We need to be thinking about that at the tactical level, that operational level of exactly when and how we do the scouting, when and how we do the collections. But we also need to be incorporating this seed work at a strategic planning level to make sure those seed needs that are ultimately critical to our reforestation success are given a place of appropriate importance within that planning process. Because, down the line, if we don't have the seed we need for a particular area, that's going to be potentially a big bottleneck. And one of our challenges is that this work requires a lot of flexibility, I would say a lot of opportunism, being willing to kind of jump on those opportunities for collection when they arise, and being able to adapt and work with feedback loops to figure out how to improve our seed work going forward, because there's a lot we need to learn on this in the Southwest. So Rachel mentioned the reforestation pipeline. I expect most of you are familiar with this, but this is sort of our organizational framework for the training, working through the seed, the nursery, and the planting and monitoring work. And so, of course, I'm covering the seed here, and then my colleagues, Jeremy and Owen, will be covering the nursery and the planting work following up. We also have the target plant concept that I hope most of you will be familiar with. If not, I absolutely encourage you to look into it, because this provides a great tactical planning framework for how to think through designing an effective, efficient, and hopefully successful reforestation operation on the lands we manage. Not going to focus on this, not going to get into detail in this presentation, but I always like to highlight this in case folks aren't familiar with it, because it's a really good way, I feel, of organizing our thinking and planning. And of course, in the case of seed, our seed sources, our selection of seed resources and how we incorporate that into our reforestation can actually play a role, can factor in a number of these steps in the target plant concept reforestation planning process. So, I mentioned in kind of the title that this is going to be focused on needs-based approaches to meeting our seed needs. And a lot of times people, see that and they immediately think of the seed itself. One of the first things I want to do is to get people thinking more broadly about the kinds of things that can actually be needs or prerequisites in relation to our seed collection capacity, and consequently our ability to put seed in the seed bank for these operations. And so in terms of seed supply chain players, all of the different professionals that we have to engage with, that we have to work with, whose workflows and lead times and logistics we have to understand for effective seed work, this is a pretty hefty list, right? We need to be thinking about the actual foresters and folks that are coordinating the work, the on-the-ground scouting and monitoring personnel, the actual collectors, climbers that are going to be getting those cones out of the trees for us, the transport personnel who can be moving personnel and cones around and seed around for us, the extractories and their personnel that are actually going to be popping those cones, getting the seed out, the seed banks where that seed's going to be stored and where it will hopefully be, for us to call it out for a sowing order, the labs that are doing the testing so that we have quality control, quality assurance with regard to our seed lots so that nursery managers can plan appropriately with regard to their sowing rates, the nursery managers that need to know what seed is potentially available to fill a given sowing order. And then, of course, the finance side of this, how we juggle the budgets and how we fund all these different aspects of the process. So one of the first things I would say here is, although we will be talking about seed and cone work more directly, I want to put it out there up front that as often as not, a lot of our bottlenecks when it comes to seed supply chain are not necessarily just, the biological production of seed itself and the actual collection of that seed. It's somewhere else in the supply chain or multiple other places that kind of cascade and hinder our ability to successfully get seed in the seed bank. So I want to mention that kind of up front. And then as an overview of the seed collection process, kind of where those folks might tie in. We would typically start with an identification of those seed needs. If you're Forest Service, if you're working on a forest or on a district, presumably you have a seed plan. Whether or not that's totally up to date varies, I find. But, just kind of by reg, there should be a seed plan somewhere that lines out what those needs are by species, by zone, by elevation, how much you need. And then sort of more subjectively on the forest or on the silviculturist side, we can be thinking about other characteristics we might want to look for in a collection, but then also our quantity and inventory. That we usually think of as a needs assessment there to put together a seed plan is kind of step one. And then there's the scouting. I typically, as you see here, will separate out scouting from monitoring. So I think of scouting as crop detection, plain and simple, covering ground, getting observations of where there are or are not developing crops, versus monitoring, which is going to be more intensive and include follow-up periodically of those identified crops to assess their development, maturation, seed fill, embryo development, so on, up to the point of being able to time our collection based on those monitoring observations, then the actual collection, extraction and cleaning, testing and storage, getting that into inventory in a seed bank, and then the inventory management, which I'll also say in my experience, we're often not all of us great on. In some cases, we end up with particular sources that we need that we come up way short on and just don't have an inventory. And then in other cases, we have seed that might be actually aging out and losing viability in storage because it hasn't been called out for a sowing order. And that's where I think we need to adopt this use it or lose it mindset when it comes to seed inventory management. And I'll talk a bit about that later. And then thinking about our seed transfers. And in a couple of ways, seed transfers in terms of potentially assisted migration, but also seed transfers in terms of organizationally, institutionally, how can we potentially share seed resources amongst ourselves to, fill gaps and get the work done on the ground. So to quickly kind of run through that process, and then we'll focus a little more on planning and then get into some planning resource tools. When we're thinking about identifying those seed needs, and this is on the seed plan end, need to be thinking about what those anticipated or potential artificial regeneration needs are. And I mentioned here that you should include in your seed plan, your seed needs assessment, both your planned and unplanned needs. And again, there are a couple of ways to interpret that. Your planned needs might include, your harvest needs, your post-harvest reforestation needs if you have a land base that is managed for operational harvests. But then planned needs, in my mind, also includes those disturbance-based reforestation needs that fall in that planting need category post-fire from high severity areas. Where I'm mentioning unplanned needs here, and this is getting to an area that I think a lot of us need improvement on with our seed needs planning. When I'm thinking about filling out seed bank for unplanned needs, I'm referring to those potential future fires that we need to make sure we have seed in the seed bank that is of appropriate species, seed source, elevation band for. Because if we think about it in the Southwest, we're under basically a fire regime now where in any given year, any of our districts could burn almost in their totality. And up to 25% of that in any given fire might be high severity that gets categorized as planting need. And so we're now in a situation where just because of the stochasticity, the unpredictability of that fire regime that could, hit just about any of us in any year, I would argue we need to work towards seed banks that have, in terms of source and elevation band, 100% coverage for states and regions, and with amounts sufficient to cover up to 25% of the land base at any given time. I realize is very, very ambitious, but that would be my suggestion as a target. Then, of course, making sure that, that all aligns with your planning needs. And of course, there's triage to this. As a starting point, we look at what's in inventory. We compare that to our needs and our categorized needs. And that difference, that is your quantified seed need. That gives you a quantitative as well as qualitative estimate of what sources you should be targeting. Once we get to that point, we can start scouting. And whether that is intentional and we are tasking personnel specifically to go out and look for crops in specific areas of identified need on the seed plan, or whether that's incidental, where we have personnel that are out on the ground performing some other set of job duties, whatever their day-to-day looks like, but then having them feed back into us any observations that they just happen to make of where there are crops developing. Both of those approaches to scouting are very useful, very informative, and in my experience, very helpful on the front end for helping to guide collection efforts. And we'll get to later, we'll get to an app that we've developed actually American Forests developed it, and then we collaborated with American Forests to adapt the app to Region 3. Some of you have helped us pilot that last year. And I want to introduce that and kind of spread the word about that this year, because that's going to be one of our tools that we're using to help make scouting a lot more efficient in terms of time allocation as well as cost efficiency through the New Mexico Reforestation Center. So we'll get to that in the resources at the end. Monitoring then, monitoring becomes a little more intensive, a little more intentional, where we need to go out and you see that cut face in the picture on the right. When we're monitoring, we actually need to get cones off the trees, look at seed fill in the cones relative to, what the potential yield would be, and start making some decisions about which crops might constitute viable collectible crops that would meet our needs, meet our yield expectations, versus which crops we might just, write off as not being efficiently collectible or sufficient for our needs. And so, you're looking at quantity, you're looking at condition, how buggy are they? What's your seed fill? How's your embryo development look like? How mature are those embryos and cones? How far out from collection are we? And we could easily do a whole workshop on this and get into species specifics of things we might look for. But we will save that for the in-person gig later. So then actual seed collection processes, when that monitoring tells us we're ready for the collection, we've lined up and identified those crops that best align with our needs that we identified earlier, then we need to figure out how we're getting that. Some of you might be familiar with squirrel cache collection as a collection method where folks are literally just going out and raiding squirrel caches for cones to pull the seeds out. That's a, kind of typical private sector thing. I'm not aware of anyone public sector that still does that. Not recommended. Don't need to spend a whole lot of time on that here because, we're not controlling genetics. There are wildlife conflict issues, a whole list of reasons that we generally don't want to get into squirrel cache collection. Kind of middle of the road on the fast, easy, cheap end of collection that can be our fastest, highest yield for the money would be fell and pick collections. We would typically only do those, and this is why I list them as conditionally recommended, in situations where cone-bearing trees are going to be felled for other operational reasons anyway. Typically, if we're collecting cones from a tree, it's because that's going to be a superior, desirable, healthy, good, well-adapted tree that we don't want to lose from the gene pool in that area. So we would not recommend fell and pick unless you're running a thinning or harvest anyway and are able to align the period of cone maturity with the period of felling, and if the contractors are willing to be accommodating enough to, move folks to a different area so that it's safe to go in and pull some cones when they're ripe. Most of what we do for collections is going to be tree climbing and getting trained, experienced climbers up in those trees when the cones have been identified as ripe to pull and bag those cones. And this again could easily be its own other set of trainings on how we arrange that, how we interact and contract with climbers, what that process looks like, what the communication should look like. And then after that, there's the transport and handling logistics for those cones to make sure they don't degrade, make sure they don't just sit out in the sun somewhere and cook. Getting them to the extractory, getting them processed, getting the seed pulled out, de-winged, cleaned, tested, put into storage, and then that inventory management and, figuring out what the use plan is, or the transfer plan is if you have partners that might be making use of that. But ideally, and I think what we're working toward operationally is to get our collected seed grown into seedlings and put in the ground for reforestation as quickly as possible. Ideally, we want to shorten that timeline to maximize the use efficiency of our seed and reduce their holding time in storage. So then when it comes to working with partners, because this is something that we can all benefit from, especially as we're in the early stages of building capacity across our institutions. Some of the low-hanging fruit here that has been super valuable in our experience is sharing information. Sharing your needs assessments with partners to see if maybe they have some of that in inventory, but just as importantly, so that everybody is on the same page with what they need so they can be thinking about where they might be able to collaborate on future collections, or where they might see a cone crop that they know partner X might need, but maybe they don't. And then also sharing information on best practices. Every season we learn new things. We learn better ways to do something. We learn things that are maybe less efficient, that could be improved. And that's a key part of the reforestation pipeline and the target plant concept, is this idea of feedback and adaptive management, so that every year we're improving our processes, we're improving our outcomes across the entire pipeline. And that's something that working with partners can help with, just basically pooling our knowledge, pooling our experience, and then sharing that data and those outcomes so we all kind of know where we are with things. We've done a lot of shared trainings over the last couple of years, and that's something we're going to continue to do. Collaborating on operations. I want to give a whole lot of credit to the Forest Service here for both collaborating on operations with us at the New Mexico Reforestation Center, as well as facilitating permitting, which we haven't touched on today, but getting access to those cone crops, depending on what land base you interact with, access and permitting are not always easy. And often they can be a challenge depending on the situation. But I want to give a lot of credit to Region 3 Forest Service here for, greatly facilitating our collection permits here, for helping us out with scouting. There have been a lot of folks on the districts and forests that have helped, with the app that we mentioned by providing scouting observations and feedback, and working with us to deconflict between Forest Service planned collections and non-Forest Service planned collections. Those communications are important here. And then ultimately figuring out how we can share these seed resources, especially among the public and not-for-profit partners, to make the best and most effective use of those seed resources. And so I feel like we're doing a pretty good job of that in Region 3. But have a lot of conversation to go, I think, to figure out how to smooth some things out. And then, kind of like we've alluded to, figuring out efficient division of labor among all those different players, all those different areas of the pipeline, even just the seed pipeline we mentioned. Some brief comments on planning with regard to seed objectives, inventory management, et cetera. We already covered this, but this gets into some of the specific questions that you want to address. If you're Forest Service, I know you already covered this in your seed plan, so we don't need to belabor it. If you're non-Forest Service, pretty intuitive, right? That, thinking of acreage, what's the species mix, how many seedlings do we need? And then back translating that into numbers and amounts of seed and figuring out the right source and elevation band. So this I want to comment a little bit on, because this is another layer of how I think about seed objectives beyond that seed plan. The seed plan is pretty sterile. It's pretty cut and dried for what we need, what we're looking for, and where. But if we want to add a layer to that, to how we think about our triage or what to target first in that seed plan, one way of thinking about that is screening it based on what crops we identify during scouting in a particular year. But then if we have multiple crops that would meet our seed plan in a given year, then we can go back and thinking about our objectives in terms of how we prioritize different cover types, different species, which seed sources and elevations and zones might be most critical, most needed out of everything that appears on that seed plan. We might run triage based on quantities in our objectives. There might be some sources that we have a crop for that we need in a smaller, more easily collectible amount rather than another one. So there might be some that we might decide to prioritize because we can just send out an in-house trained climber or two for, it'd be at least a 2-person climber team. But we might have some small ones that we can just decide, hey, let's go grab this one. What are you guys doing the end of next week? They're going to be ripe. And then the time required for these collections and how much time we have to allocate to scouting and running those operations can also play a role in our triage. So oftentimes after we have our assessment, this is sort of what I would be considering for how we start prioritizing the order of addressing those needs. So it's maybe less daunting. And then some final comments to move us into looking at some resources to support this. Just overall considerations for seed sourcing in this work in a changing climate. First thing, which is just an objective scientific fact at this point, rates of climate change that we are seeing measurably on the ground exceed the rate of adaptation in the species we manage for trees. So that is just a challenging fundamental fact of our ecological and climatic context in which we're operating right now. And as a result, in order for our work to be successful, we need to design operations and prescriptions that will succeed under both current and future climates. And, you know, I expect that's probably obvious to everybody in the meeting, but I think it's worth highlighting because it's easy to get bogged down in, you know, figuring out how to meet, you know, this day zero seed plan that we're trying to catch up on and lose sight of, well, okay, how are these seed sources we're collecting going to perform in 50 years, going to perform in 100 years when they're reaching rotation age and maybe we're looking for natural regen, which often we are. We're looking for artificial regen now to reestablish breeding populations that will be able to support those ecosystems through natural regeneration going forward. These are all considerations that, even though the outcomes are a century or more down the line, are impacted by our decisions today. So I always want to highlight that. And so there are different approaches for that. There's assisted migration, which could be its own workshop, how we incorporate ecotype-based seed source selection into our planning and operations. And then kind of in worst case scenarios, thinking about type conversion of some of the stands we manage to anticipate species composition shifts that we're already starting to observe. You know, again, just for the sake of moving into some of the resources that we want to look at, won't spend a lot of time here, but on assisted migration, I know there are differences of opinion, differences of thought, and even the science sort of differs on projected outcomes of some of these practices. But I want to get people thinking about assisted migration in maybe a more judicious and concrete way, and as more of a continuum. Because assisted migration could even be as simple as making transfer decisions for sources within existing zones. For example, from the southern end of an existing zone to the more northern end of an existing zone. That is something that we can do today, which is in compliance with existing regulations, guidance, handbook regs, that, you know, even that can incrementally help our outcomes going forward. And so that's just one example. You know, moving up from within zone transfer, you know, in some cases, there can be arguments made for cross zone transfers. And then in some cases, there are arguments being made for range expansion. That all, you know, again, could be its own debate, could be its own workshop. But there is operational evidence that, you know, this is potentially where we need to go in some places. Quick comment on the ecotype-based seed source selection. This really has to do with how we pick and choose those parent trees to go into a collection. If we're looking for 20 parent trees to contribute to a source, historically in more timber-focused days, that might mean looking for those straightest, tallest, fastest growth rate, most knot-free, flat branch angle trees. You know, we don't necessarily want to abandon those timber criteria for seed collections going forward, but we also need everything we plant to survive as much as possible. So we really need to start looking for characteristics in trees that are reflective of ecological fitness and survivability on these harsh post-transplant sites. So figuring out how to target those drought-tolerant sites. They should be easy to Google, most of them. But if folks aren't familiar with the Ringer website, I want to make sure we introduce you to that up front. Woody Plant Seed Manual, which is fantastic and super, super informative. Want to make sure we get the website with the contact info and locations of the nurseries and seed extractories in the Forest Service system on your radar, because the folks at those facilities are fantastic resources. Some of them are here today, but you know, my experience, they're always fantastically knowledgeable, very helpful for giving feedback when it comes to planning. And then finally, introduce you to the scouting app that we're looking at, and then the seed lot selection tool that can help with some guidance. And so we're going to breeze through a lot of this here. So not going to go through it, but rngr.net, Forest Service Reforestation Nurseries and Genetics Resources. Jeremy mentioned that he's part of their staff there. This website is going to be your single best resource for all information reforestation related. It's absolutely an amazing repository of information. So let me move this little bar out of the way if I can. Okay, so jumping over from that Ringer site, if you navigate through publications, you can go to seed publications, and then you can work your way toward the Woody Plant Seed Manual. This manual, it's encyclopedic. It has a bunch of universal information up front and then is organized by genus. That'll give you pretty much anything you want to know. And we go back to this literally almost every day in our seed operations to figure out one thing or another for something. So highly recommend that to everybody. Not exactly light reading, but really informative stuff. Next thing, jumping over here. So buried in the Forest Service's website, and you can find it through Google, you can find it through internal searches. You get to the list of existing nurseries and extractories within the Forest Service system. And most of you, that are Forest Service, I expect are already familiar with this at least to the extent that you need to be. But for non-Forest Service even, this is a lot of our knowledge base in the country when it comes to nursery management. Between Ringer and between the Forest Service nursery and extractory system, these folks are a whole lot of our knowledge base. And even for non-Forest Service, and especially for non-Forest Service, I would recommend, getting to know some of these facilities and operations. If you're non-Forest Service, maybe you're state, tribal, maybe you're with one of the county open spaces in Colorado. These can be good resources for picking people's brains about functional, effective models for nurseries, for extractories, and seed banks. And so you can get to their contact info through here. Quick visual on related to scouting. This is the scouting app that we worked with American Forests to develop. It's a Survey 123 app that we worked with them to tailor to Region 3. And any user can provide scouting observations through this. And so if you're Region 3 Forest Service, we will probably be bugging you in a month or two just to put this on the radar again of forests and districts that might have seed needs that overlap with, what the Reforestation Center is trying to get in the bank. And to kind of help reduce the burden on any given party for scouting and monitoring. We didn't mention earlier, but oftentimes about half of the overall cost of any seed collection operation falls on the scouting and monitoring work that happens before we ever put climbers in the tree. So the more we can spread this out, the more efficient and effective we're all going to be. But basically all the info we need, so starts out with affiliation. If you're in the field using this, it's going to geolocate your device that you're logging it from. So it'll automatically get the coordinates for that seed crop observation. It'll timestamp it for us. Property type, access issues, potential collection hazards. And then there'll be information to click through for what your cone crop observations are. By species, it'll have you upload. So as you're clicking on those, it'll get into some further drop downs that'll trigger for you to rate the cone crop in terms of how prolific it is, yield and such. And then down through uploading, an image of it. And then when you submit that, that is what, and it's pretty quick. It gives a user, a 2-3 minute process to upload scouting observations. And then on the back end, so the back end would be available, like access would be available by request for our Forest Service partners. We'd send you the link and get you access. But back end that we use for then planning collections is we kind of have this handy dandy visualization tool where, let's say we're looking for our PIPO crops last year. Let's say we're maybe looking for our heavy PIPO crops from last year. Ignore elevation band for now. And this will pull up for us where those crops were that observations were submitted for. And then we can go in and look at all of the metadata for those observations. What was the elevation band? We've got it worked with American Forest to program in. It already identifies seed zone, whether it's the provisional seed zone or in the case of PIPO, the PIPO specific empiric seed zones. And so, as well as all the info about who uploaded the observation if we need to follow up. So that's just a quick introduction to that app that, we've got that covers region 3 wide for anyone that's interested in adopting that, because that's open for use by Forest Service to help facilitate your scouting just as much as it is ours. So contact myself or our seed collection coordinator, Puli Sakelianos, if you want more info about that. And then the final thing that I want to introduce folks to, if you're not familiar with it as we wrap it up, is the seed lot selection tool. And so seed lot selection tool was developed as a collaboration with USDA, and gives us basically a non-zone based way to model potential seed transferability. And you've got all the info on the landing page. You can get into kind of the background of it. But as a tool, and of course, if you're Forest Service, you're constrained by your existing zone system and whatever your current FSH amendment says with regard to your seed zones in force in your region. But if you want a second opinion to see how some of that zone-based transfer guidance might align with potential future climate scenarios, this is a good tool for it. And so starting out, there are two ways to use it. It says find seed lots versus find planting sites. And I'll also kind of give you the caveat that this thing, again, like a lot of things, could be its own training. But basically, do you have a planting site that you need a seed lot for? That would be this first selection. Or do you have a seed lot and you're looking to see where that seed should go for reforestation under a given scenario? And so just for a quick example here, I'll say, let's find a planting site. And in that case, you're assuming you have a seed lot that you're trying to figure out transferability for. And I've got a seed lot picked out. This is a Borrego Mesa seed lot in New Mexico, latitude 36.0036 for the center of the collection, longitude negative 105.8397. So we plug that in, and then select region. The default is central US. Select climate scenarios. What climate are the seed lots adapted to? So 1961 to 1990. And in our case, that's basically when the parent trees this seed lot came from would have been established. So we're, for this purpose, assuming that's the window. But then next question, when should trees be best adapted to the planting site? And so for near term, a lot of times I'll run bracketed scenarios in sequence. A lot of times I'll do a first one for the establishment phase, early post-planting, that'd be 2011 to 2040. If you're familiar with the IPCC, RCP approach here, your only two options are the 4.5 pathway versus 8.5. So kind of, like what we're maybe expecting versus what might be a really, really bad. And so we can leave it at 4.5. Select the transfer limit method. For an example, we can do zone, and species is just going to be generic here. and provisional, selecting climate variables. This is where the model can tell you very different things depending what you select, because you got a whole laundry list. So for our purposes, let's go mean annual precipitation, and we'll come back and fill that in. Let's go mean summer precipitation, because that's going to have a big impact on establishment of the seedlings, that early post-transplant precipitation if we're doing a monsoon planting in the Southwest. Let's go ahead and do extreme maximum temperature and extreme minimum temperature. So just for purposes of a quick example, kind of get those things represented that are going to be most likely to kill a tree, kill a baby tree out of that. And then we need to parameterize those. So it doesn't auto-populate, but if we hover over, so in this case, the center, you see this little box pop up telling us that for the location we selected, that's an indication of the current mean annual precipitation there. And then like the mean summer precipitation hover over that, it's telling us that the current value for the coordinates we put in would be 187. We're in metric here. But just to run a quick example, I'm going to plug these centers in as the current values, since we're thinking about a projection of early post-transplant survivability. But then transfer limit, let's say, survivability would be plus or minus 10% relative to the current value. So then plug in a transfer limit as 33, call it 18.7, call it 4. And we can be, of course, more scientific about this and dial it in a little more, because the interpretation can depend a lot on, where sort of how we parameterize this. I'm going to constrain it by species range for ponderosa pine, since that's a ponderosa seed source. And then we'll run it. And it's going to sit here for a minute and think about it. And apparently a lot of other folks running these right now. But what it's going to generate is basically a heat map. In this case, since we ran it as looking for planting sites that would be appropriate for a given seed source under those projections, it's going to generate what amounts to a heat map for the areas. And let me move this bar out of the way so I can zoom in. And we'll probably have to zoom pretty far in here. And where are you?
Zoom to your left to Santa Clara, Los Alamos, Valles, Cadera.
Did you see any? So the green boundaries are not the transfer recommendations. Oh, I see it. We got to keep zooming in. This is going to be interesting. Where'd it go? I thought I saw it. We're looking for yellow and orange blobs. Yep, there they are.
Nothing like doing this live, huh, Josh?
Yeah, yeah. And with a made-up example that I didn't bother trying. This is just a interesting random seed lot I pulled out coordinates for. But you see these little orange blobs. Those are the little areas that would be expected to be good transfer matches for that seed lot under those specified scenarios, which aren't actually crazy projections. And so even this is kind of an interesting example to show how limited the transferability of some of our seed lots might be under some scenarios. So this is something, and I know we're at time here, so I'll wrap it up so we can move on. But that's something that I definitely recommend that people get in there and kind of play with that. That can be a tool to help inform even within zone guidance, because you saw how small some of those match potentials were.
Thanks to the team for allowing me to be here. This has been a great opportunity. And also Josh, too, for setting the stage. A lot of great information there, a lot of information that I use, and also talking about the target plant concept. I'm going to talk about that, and the seed lot selection tool, which is something that I've used. And there's a lot going on that tool. And I want to say, like, if you need help, just reach out. Also, too, in my office where I sit, one of the makers of the tools is like several offices down, and it was just nice for me to be able to walk down to his office and say, "What does this mean? You know, how should I set this up in a logical fashion to get a meaningful output?" And when it happens, it's great. It's a good thing. So we're talking about the pipeline today, and I'm privileged to be here to talk about the nursery section of the pipeline. This is a roadmap of which I'll cover for my talk. I'll talk target plant concept, just as Josh mentioned. Stock type choices, I'll give an overview on that. Nursery production and seedling quality. Again, just a short amount of time, so just a lot of high level stuff. I won't even cover everything on my screen. I'll probably be going so fast to keep time. The last 2 points there are some of the resources that cover not only Josh's presentation, but mine and Owen's as well. My colleague and friend and the Western Nursery Specialist on our team, Nabil Kaduri, will be covering those in a later section. So with that, I'll just start my presentation because I am a seedling guy and I'm a nursery guy. I always like to start this out. Seedlings are the building blocks for nearly all healthy forests and landscapes. Even if the building blocks are tiny like that, eventually they become big ones and the foundation for what we're looking for in our goals and in our applications. And by seedlings, I don't always just refer to nursery produced seedlings, but also to naturally produced seedlings, because sometimes target plants are the ones that you want nature to produce, or you maybe want seed to produce all on their own. But for the sake of this presentation, it's solely based on nursery stock and how we use nursery stock as a tool in the toolbox for our reforestation objectives. And I just want to point this out, and probably a lot of you know this, but nursery is a pretty good tool. It's really good at flexing the phenotypic plasticity of what seedlings can do. So this picture illustrates two different scenarios. On the left, you see 3 little seedlings circled in red. Those seedlings germinated in nature and are approximately 1 season old. And don't get me wrong, nature knows how to do things best. Those seedlings, you know, given they get past the establishment phase, will go on to do great things. But in certain situations, we need to provide a little boost in situations where maybe we don't have enough seed nearby, or maybe the landscape has changed dramatically enough to where seeds may not have a chance if they germinate on their own. So nurseries, again, can do something pretty fantastic, in which these seedlings that you see in the center of your screen are, you know, for example, 1 season old as well. And those 2 seedlings, or those seedlings you see there, are also grown in the same greenhouse from the same seed lot in roughly the same amount of time. So we can have a lot of culturing tools in the nursery to create different sizes and shapes that help us meet our reforestation goals. Keep in mind that all has to do with species and being able to work within the species constraints, the genetics of those species. And then there are other factors involved too that help us dictate the size and shape of the seedlings that we're trying to produce, which I'll cover. So the target plant concept, as Josh illustrated earlier, is just something near and dear to my heart. I feel is like the roadmap for what we're doing. It's a good place for us to answer questions and make sure that we're in a process that we don't forget key things along the way. I have this simple version of the target plant concept illustrating that it's a feedback loop as well, right? We want to make sure that this is a continuing process in which we define materials, we produce them, we put them in the field, we see how they grow, we evaluate them, and then when we go back and do this again, we've got all that information which we gathered and we can do it better. Okay, so now here's the more complicated version, which doesn't illustrate that feedback loop quite as well. But I want to point out here that the target plant concept relies on a lot of factors. Again, the roadmap that you need to consider for creating your plant material for your successful project. The three things at the top are probably the guiding factors that will make sure that this is successful or not. And one of the primary things is communication, and that the nursery that you're working with and the client have a partnership and communicate with one another. Both of them have a lot of expertise in their individual areas, but unless you work together to leverage each other's strengths, it won't work out as well. The other thing I want to point out too is the outplanting site. Where these seedlings are going to end up dictates a lot of what your plant material is going to look like. And then we want to also make sure that high quality seedlings are actually going into those sites so that they can do the job they want to do. But the rest of the concept outlines a lot of questions that we can use to help formulate what a target plant is when we go through this iterative process. So it's just some key take-home things. The target plant concept, it helps us understand the dynamics that contribute to successful reforestation, or in this case, rapid seedling establishment. I like to think of this as an opportunity to identify the factors that interrupt the processes of natural ecosystem functioning, or what are those things that, like Josh mentioned, what are those things that want to kill my baby trees? You know, we want to, I think I heard a saying once, it was like, I don't know, it was like a saying that's like, there's one way to produce a seedling. There's like 20 different things that want to kill your seedling or something like that. You know, it's like, there's a lot of things out there that want to disrupt that process. But the target plant concept can help us design a seedling that can help us kind of like overcome some of those limiting factors. And then we implement a plan by communicating and working with our nursery. And this is what we're looking for. We're looking for, when we put a plant in the ground, we have simultaneous things happen. We have a high quality seedling that has foliage that can photosynthesize and allocate carbon. We have roots that are healthy and willing to grow and take up water. And all these things are working simultaneously so that the plant can couple with the site that it's planted on and then do its job. And this is also a positive feedback. So this is kind of what we're shooting for when we talk about producing seedlings, putting them in the ground and having them high quality so that they can do the jobs they're intended for. So building a target seedling, I like to say, you know, you start at the outplanting site. Again, we can flex the muscles of what the seedling is capable of, and we can use the tools in the toolbox of nurseries to express what those sizes or shapes or physical nature of these seedlings are. And it really depends on a lot of things, though, when we think about this. It depends on species. It depends on the container that we choose also as well. And then also that species container interaction. If you choose a large container, for example, some species may not grow fast enough to fill the entire space of that container within a growing system, within a growing season. So that's something to consider. So time in the nursery is important. It's also important to consider what your outplanting window is. Also there are things like budgets, but then, you know, when we think of the options that are out there, we start to think, wow, there are a lot, but then we also have to think about some of the logistical constraints that we're faced with, including what some of the limitations are of some of the equipment that we have at the nursery, for example. I mean, just because we may want like something like this gigantic ponderosa pine that you see here doesn't mean that we can produce that in a logical manner with the equipment that's available at the time either as well. So working, again, communicating what the needs are and realizing what your limitations are to leverage the strengths and resources. I started getting involved in like analyzing different stock types a long time ago. And even a long time ago, there was a lot of choices out there. We used to have a display here at the nursery close by to me at the University of Idaho, and it was a full wall of all these different container types that seedlings could be grown in. And that was then. And now we have even companies that are still designing new container types to produce seedlings in. And so what I've found is, despite all the years that we've been working on these things, people still have a lot of questions as to which system they should be using, which is the best for their application. So if you find yourself asking this question, it's logical. It's not new, and it's something that we definitely should be talking and having conversations about. Yeah, new container types are coming up all the time, and you know, new ways of getting seedlings to survive. So seedling stock type choices. I was kind of asked to kind of maybe go over at a high level what we might be thinking of when we're choosing what stock types we're using in the nursery. And so the recommendations that I'll kind of glance over here real quick come from the literature and they come from experience. But for dry outplanting sites, some of the research that I've done and some of the stuff that I've seen in the literature, as well as the experiences I've talked to folks are that long root systems can do well on dry outplanting sites. And for those reasons are this illustration that you see at the top of the screen here. It's logical in some areas that the deeper you go in the soil moisture, deeper you go in the soil profile, you're likely to have more persistent moisture. And so if you have a seedling that has a longer root system, that seedling may have access to that water for a greater length of time as opposed to a seedling with a shorter root system. And I put an asterisk next to this because it is logical and it does make sense, but also from a target plant concept approach, this isn't always the logical choice for your outplanting site. If you're choosing, if you have an outplanting site that has maybe some dry conditions, you may also have shallow, short, rocky soils. And so it doesn't make sense to buy a seedling with a long root system if you can't get it in the ground. And the illustration down below that graphic shows where seedlings with long root systems were planted in shallow soils. And even though the goal was to get seedlings with long root systems deeper in the soil profile to access moisture, when they were planted by the contractors, they planted them improperly because of the shallow soils, and now you're faced with this challenge right off the bat. Some other things that go along with this are larger root systems. We think of seedlings with larger root systems, they have more roots available to explore the surrounding soil around them. So that is, they have the opportunity to grow roots into areas that have more moist soil or more available water. And then another thing for dry outplanting sites is favorable shoot to root ratios. We want to make sure that seedlings are balanced in their ability, again, like that establishment model graphic that I showed earlier. They're balanced in their ability to be able to take up water and also be able to photosynthesize and then transpire without losing too much water at the same time. So you see the seedling on the far right, really tall, really short root system. That, for example, may not have a favorable shoot to root ratio for a dry outplanting site because it's got a lot of shoot area, a lot of potential transpirational loss of water area compared to the amount of roots that it has. However, though, in a situation where you may have an outplanting site with lots of vegetative competition that you might not be able to knock down with herbicides or treat in other ways, it has been shown that seedlings that are taller that can compete for the available light might be better. So that's a situation where a stock type that has a tall shoot might be more favorable. So again, just a few more just general trends. Large seedlings, some of the literature and some of my research has shown that they tend to maintain their size advantage over time. So that's something to think about. They tend to be a little more robust and more capable to withstand physical damage, but they are more expensive. They're more expensive to produce in the nursery. They take up more space. They take up more soil media and more nutrients, for example. And so they cost more. And then also, that cost translates over into shipping and also translates over into planting expenses as well. On the other hand, small seedlings can do well on mesic sites if you're not too worried about soil moisture being a limiting factor, a severely limiting factor. Small stock, high quality stock can grow really well, very well equally. They're cheaper because they take up less resources in the nursery and they take up less space in the nursery. So the cost per square foot goes down and they're easier to plant as well. And so the picture that I have on the far right here, that's a picture of me like probably 10 years ago, measuring a site where I planted 4 cubic inch seedlings and then also 8 cubic inch seedlings. And you can see after 10 years, that is a slope right there. Those two different seedlings grew the same. And so here we have, we could spend less money on small seedlings that will do just equally as well. Over the years, we've done a few examples, like a few back of the napkin analyses, economic analyses on cost per seedling. because we know that, oftentimes budgets dictate what you're choosing. And in the case where we had some like long-term data where we were looking at the analysis of bare root versus container. Container seedlings were more expensive. They had a higher survival rate compared to bare root seedlings, which were probably 15 to 20% less survival rates. But when you consider all other variables, including like shipping and cost to plant and some of the other things involved, if you do some economic analysis, you may see that in some cases you can, in fact, choose bare root seedlings, but just plant more, and the cost for surviving seedling could be about the same or even more favorable. So it's important to kind of think about things in those regard when it comes to stock type choices as well. So notes on stock types, because I got to keep flying along here. There's lots of possibilities. If you're thinking about exploring those possibilities, take a look at the literature. There are a lot of stock type studies that have been done out there. I don't think there are a lot in the Southwest, but there have been stock type studies that have been done in similar climates that would have some applicability. I always like to say, ask the experienced professionals, ask the nursery growers, and ask the field, the people who work in the field and who are planting seedlings, what their experiences are with different types of stock types. You can get a lot of information there. Communicate with your nursery as well. Find out what they're good at growing and what kind of feedback they've gotten on different stock types for different scenarios over the years as well. That's pretty valuable. I think some of the Forest Service nurseries, years ago, I got to take part in what they have called is the clients meeting, where the nursery gets all the foresters together and gets to talk about the situations of what worked in the nursery and what worked in the field, what didn't work, all again to kind of help improve the process so that they're sharing information to improve the target plants for the next times around. Stock type studies are another way to gather information. A lot of folks maybe like to think about doing this on their own. I think it's kind of cool to be inquisitive and do this type of stuff. If you have the opportunity, sure, you can do it. But I do want to say, be careful. Stock type studies are, to do them right, they're really, really difficult to do. So a while back, and I didn't figure that out until I started to take a deep dive in that. But if you're starting to think about doing something on an outplanting site, maybe contact myself or Owen or Josh or even Nabil, because there are certain things that you can put into play ahead of time so that you don't fall into the pitfalls of what I would say previous stock type studies that the data aren't very good in. So again, something to think about. So now I'm going to shift gears and go into quality seedling production. Nurseries, they produce seedlings. It's easy to do, right? You just get some seed, you just water them, provide some fertilizer. Maybe you read a manual or two and just blammo, all of a sudden you've got good high quality seedlings ready to go in the ground. I think that's kind of always been the joke. And this is the cover of a nursery manual from 1979. So this kind of a joke has been around for a while. And in fact, I was just talking about this with another colleague. She manages a nursery. She was just thinking like, wow, I often think of this cartoon in my brain I didn't know exists, but this is often how I feel. Like, how did I pull that off, or how did that happen, or whatever. But in fact, there's a lot more that goes into this. But I do want to come back to this manual as well. I keep this close at hand on my desk because there was a question earlier that talked about seed calculations and the amount of seed to use per cell and germination rates. And this book from 1979 has these tables in the back that are all probability tables that are all pre-calculated, and they go through everything: germination percent, the amount of seeds per cell, and the amount of expected empty cells that you might expect versus filled cells in your nursery. So this is like, it's old document and it's super basic and just using a table, but it's really, 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 really functional. So anyways, it's not just the magic to produce quality seedlings. I appreciated Josh earlier showing that seed and seed collection and seed management is much more complicated than we would typically think. It's the same thing for nursery production. There's a lot going on there. and it requires a lot of skill and knowledge to produce seedlings. And so this is why it's important to think about and make relationships with your nursery growers, and also give them a break from time to time, because they're balancing a lot of things to try and produce seedlings for your projects. So and a lot of it doesn't have to do with just irrigation and fertilizer, for example. I mean, you know, we're talking about pest management. We're talking about administration and budgeting that are trying, you know, taking time away from the production of seedlings and whatnot. Anyways, so nursery production is a pretty complicated thing. There's a lot of skill and knowledge. And I think timing is one of the things I want to emphasize for today's conversation. Timing is everything. And I didn't put this graphic up here just to show a bunch of pretty colors or just to make your eyes go crazy or whatever. But I wanted to put this up here because this comes from one of our manuals. This illustration kind of gives you a full picture of how long it might take to produce a species in a certain container size, from seed collection all the way to outplanting. And I like to show this because I think what the message is start at your outplanting site, right? Start talking about your outplanting window, and then look at this kind of chart and work backwards to see how long it's going to take to get to that, see where you need to start planning to get to that outplanting window. And this is particularly important for the Southwest, as planting windows can be anywhere from the monsoon season or on into the fall. So thinking about when you're getting those seedlings into the ground, how much time the nursery needs to produce those quality seedlings, whether it's a shortened amount of time or a lengthened amount of time, is really important. So it's important to consider that these things take time. Nursery, you know, the nursery can flex the muscles of those seedlings to different sizes and shapes based on their understanding of nursery culture and growth stages. But we can compress those timelines or lengthen those timelines, but it's important that we try and maximize each one of these stages so that we can get to a quality seedling in the end. You know, we have to have a certain amount of time for establishment, but then we have this period where we can grow things rapidly based on the species. And then we have a period of time where we have to give them a little bit of tough love before they head out the nursery. And there are some cool practices that Josh and Owen and I have worked on over the years in growing seedlings and conditioning them in the nursery for dry outplanting sites. And so there's a lot of different tools that nursery growers can use during this culturing phase that are cutting edge. So understanding nursery culture and growth stages. One of the things I did want to talk about was holding over stock as well. This is something that I've seen not only in the Southwest, but other places. Sometimes we miss our outplanting windows, and sometimes we have to hold stock over. And there have been some cases where I've seen stock is held too long, and we really want to be careful from a seedling quality standpoint that we don't hold our stock too long in certain types of containers, because if you do, you lose seedling quality, you lose stress resistance, and your chances of having a seedling establish rapidly and grow well on the site kind of go down. So you look at these plants down on the bottom here, they've been held too long, their shoots are really tall, their roots are probably compacted, and if they go out on a dry site, there's a chance they might not do too well. So seedling quality is important, you know, working that magic in the nursery to make sure your seedlings have all the right functions, morphologically, physiologically, and that they can perform. We have classes of plant quality that we measure in the nursery and in the field. They come in morphological quality assessments, physiological assessments, and performance assessments as well. I'm just going to kind of run through these real quick, and I probably need to go faster than real quick. So seedling morphology, Owen says it's fine. Owen, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Or Lauren? 2 minutes?
Yeah, we're supposed to start Q&A now, but why don't you keep going? Folks can put some questions in the chat, and
No
yeah,
questions.
so you can have up to 5 minutes if you need it.
Okay. Morphology has been a standard of seedling quality measurement it's great because the morphology measurements don't change over time. But often when we look at seedlings, we don't know what lies underneath. Like there can be some physiological mechanisms that can be compromised. So I want to caution there. But it is our standard for grading in the nursery. They include a lot of the measurements that you see here. But I like to think of morphology as proxies for physiological functioning. So, again, green needles, great photosynthesis, large stems, good plumbing systems for moving water and nutrients. So those correlations have been shown over time to show success and growth in the field. Seedling physiology is like us going to the doctor. It can be used to assess health, injury, or stress. But these types of measurements are really laborious. They're not easy. And these things can change over time from the nursery to the outplanting site. So that's important to keep in mind. But they do support a lot of the morphological measurements. And they require some specialized equipment to do. They can inform us on seedling development. We do have a lot of correlative studies that show what these physiological measurements do for us. But again, measuring them at the right time for that snapshot is important to understand. Seedling performance is another attribute. I think I'm going to skip that for now, but I want to put some notes on seedling quality is that there's a lot of different quality measurements out there. Morphology is the standard in which we kind of hold to. But I think it's up to the nursery manager and the seedling user to both talk about all that data and to collect that data and to use that data over time to make assessments on how the seedlings are performing as they come out of the nursery and as they're going into the ground. So I'm going to try and wrap up. Target plants for success. The nursery stage is super, super important. Identifying quality attributes is also super important. The target plant concept is a great tool to help us through some of these stages and choosing stock types and whatnot. And then I want to say, realize that all this stuff is interdependent. And when you get changes that happen even from the seed stage to the nursery stage, it affects everything downstream. So work together, communicate, constantly learn, and hopefully we don't have to resort to this as our target plants, these plastic pines in this really harsh environment, or these shrubs growing in front of these pubs and these plastic shrubs in concrete containers. We don't want to resort to that as our target plant. This is a manual that is a great resource for everything that I just breezed through super fast. That's me. Thanks.
Owen, I'm gonna pass it to you to start whenever you're ready to hear about outplanting.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everybody for joining this last big section. So I am going to talk about an overview of planting and post-planting activities. And some of you have seen parts of this before. I would say all of you have got some working knowledge about this, but I think it's important to reiterate a lot of the messages that I'm going to discuss today. There is a different type of group that I give this presentation to that doesn't have that working knowledge, and it's not moving. There it is. And I call the title of this slide Green Side Up. I feel like we're a bit more advanced than that group. So we're going to get a bit more technical, nerd out, have a little bit of fun. And please don't tell the authorities. I want to keep my job. So we have seen this reforestation pipeline many times before. It's funny because Josh, Jeremy, and I have been working together for a long time. So you'll probably see some of the same figures and some of the same themes over and over again. But I think that's important because it's just reinforcing those messages. And so, Josh was talking about seed, Jeremy was talking about the nursery, and I'm going to be talking about the outplanting, post-planting activities. And I think it's really important to point out that we have to invest in the entire pipeline. And so there is a ton of money and resources that goes into seed collection, seed processing, and seed banking. Josh knows this very well. Same story with the nursery. And so if we let go of the handlebars and, kind of give up at that outplanting and even at the post-planting, we may lose that initial investment. So it is really important that we invest into the entire pipeline. I think you guys have seen this one before too. But the target plant concept is going to come back up again and again. And it is an important concept. And, my focus is going to be on these two last elements here regarding the outplanting. But you'll see throughout that what I'm going to talk about connects with all other elements of the pipeline. And today, I want to give an outline of what I'm going to talk about. And it is, just like everybody else, we don't have a lot of time. So it's a 30,000-foot view of what is important in the outplanting and post-planting activities. So we're just scratching the surface, and some of these things we could probably spend an entire semester talking about. But I felt like the best way to give this outline is through a timeline. And you would think it would start with tree planting, but it actually starts with many, many, many things that happened prior to that. And so I'm going to be talking about site evaluation and planning, site preparation, nursery production, seedling transportation, on-site storage, the actual action of planting the trees and planting techniques, animal protection, inspections, monitoring and data collection, post-planting silvicultural treatments, the potential need to replant, and additional monitoring and data collection. And finally, we get to a point where seedlings are free to grow. So let's start with site evaluation and planning. And so with the initial site evaluation, we can do certain things remotely. We can characterize the sites in terms of what are the native seed sources, what are some of the climate patterns, soil characteristics, what's the competing vegetation, slope, aspect, animal pressures. We can ask the question of, does it need to be planted? So is there potential for natural regeneration? What's the size of the disturbance? And then what do the planting models suggest? Right now at the University of New Mexico, we got Dr. Marsh and Herto that are working on a model that is using input variables such as solar radiation, precipitation, topography to kind of look at a microclimate for the individual seedling, which then translates to a seedling survival probability map. It's still in its infancy, but there's a lot of promise and the research is ongoing. And then you can ask the question is, what is the likelihood of planting success? And this helps us rank against other sites for prioritization. It is very likely that you're going to have a lot of planting needs and not enough resources to do all that planting work. I think it's very important that we get out onto the site and do our initial site evaluation. It helps us confirm those site characterizations, getting out there and testing the soil. I like bringing out a planting shovel and just kind of exploring what that root zone is like in terms of that soil profile that Jeremy had kind of talked about before. And it's important to assess the site preparation needs, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about this later on. And then access logistics. How are we going to get the planting crews and equipment out there? And so based on that site evaluation, both the remote and on-site, we can begin planning. And so I know that Jeremy's already mentioned the planting season or that planting window. And for us, it's important that when we plant those seedlings, we need to match that with the highest likelihood of success. And for us, especially in the Southwest, that's when we have the highest soil moisture. And it may not materialize, so it's good to have a plan B. And you're going to see this over and over again, but it's important to work with the nursery on your plans. And so I'll talk about this a little bit later on too. Current research in the Southwest is showing that ideal times to plant first starts with the monsoon when we have the highest soil moisture, followed by the fall, followed by the spring. However, there's nothing consistent about that. I have seen really wet springs and extremely dry summers with no monsoon. So again, that's why it's important to have that plan B. Planning your planting material. So what is the target species you want to put back on that landscape? And Josh, went into a really good detail on seed source. And so what is the seed source that we need that will work best? Are we going to be integrating assisted migration into this planting program? The planting design. So what is the density at which you're going to plant the trees per acre? How are those trees going to be oriented across the landscape? Is this in a nucleation fashion, random or variable or gridded? And then I think it's important to figure out your planting logistics, how we're going to move our trees from A to B and everything in between. And I'm going to go in more detail on this a bit later on too. Some other things that need to be considered that are very important. One, it may be required for NEPA clearance or cultural surveys, especially on federal land. I think it's very important that you have to build a budget for all activities. And honestly, I think if you can, that goes all the way back to, Josh's talk about seed collection. And then that carries all the way forward to the post-planting activities. And one thing that, we need to spend a lot of time talking about, but this is just the one point I'm making today, but securing planting contractors and, try to do that as early on as possible. So now I'm going to talk about site preparation. And I think Colin had some, conversations about veg control versus taller trees and things like that. And there's a lot of debate and discussion on that, but there may be a need to get out there and control the competing vegetation. And there's different means of doing that. And it's also, important to note that we may be going into a post-fire site that's 5-10 years old. And so you've got some really established gamble oak, for example, that will likely outcompete whatever you plant. So there is going to be a need for some level of control. And pocket gophers have decimated many of my research plots. And so this is a big problem. And so trapping may be necessary to protect those trees before you plant. There may be a need to control and manage the snags and woody debris, and that could be through salvage logging or pile burns. And honestly, elk and deer to me have just been the biggest problem for a lot of my planting sites. And so there's preventative measures such as damage control hunts or animal deterrents like air cannons that can be placed before we even start planting. So at the same time that a lot of the site prep work is going on, we can start our conversations with the nursery. And so, Jeremy showed a slide about timelines and how long it takes, but the key is to place orders well in advance, at least a year prior to planting, and it may be a lot more than that. We may not even have the seed, and so this requires you to call Josh up, and he's got to climb up on that tree and start collecting cones. You need to know how much you need and put in a buffer, both for the nursery and for yourself. Of course, working with the nursery to figure out the species. And then again, the stock type, what Jeremy kind of talked about too, in terms of different sizes, what we can do in terms of conditioning, and all those things need to be planned out well in advance. And then with the planting window, again, it goes back to working with the manager. That is when how we determine when seeds are sown. And so if you're planning for a monsoon and it doesn't materialize, it may be that you have to plant in the fall. And so having that plan B is really important. And then again, working with that nursery manager, that communication is key. Have them provide you updates on how the crop is performing and vice versa. If you're seeing changes in your planting plan, you need to be working with the manager for that plan B option. So I want to briefly talk about stress to seedlings, because this is really important. And from the time that seedlings are harvested or lifted from the nursery to the time they're planted, they can be subjected to a variety of different types of stresses. So in this table here, you see on the left different processes. You've got nursery storage, handling, shipping, on-site storage, and outplanting, and you've got different types of stresses. You've got temperature and desiccation, mechanical injuries, and storage molds. But one of the things that pops out is that temperature and desiccation are of major concern, and they all are. And I think what we want to do is kind of think of this from a checkbook kind of analogy. When we harvest our seedlings, when those seedlings are lifted from the nursery, it's best to think that they're in their most optimal condition. These are the highest quality that they're going to be. So our balance at that time is 100%. And any and everything that we do from that point to the time that we plant the trees can be subjecting them to some kind of stress. So that is a withdrawal from that balance of quality. And so our goal is to minimize it. You know, you may not make it zero, but we can be preventative as best we can. And so the goal for us at the end of the day is to minimize that withdrawal and maximize that seedling quality when it goes into the planting hole. So with seedling transportation, again, you have to work with the nursery. So working on pickup dates and the schedule, you know, don't pick up more than you need, because then there's seedlings waiting around that are probably going to get stressed. Ideally, the nursery has those seedlings well watered, so that moisture content in the plug is ideal. And know how they're being packed, if they're in containers or bags or boxes, because this gives you an idea of how you're going to stack them and put them in those trucks or trailers. The transportation conditions are also very, very important. You know, in an ideal scenario, we want to be moving these seedlings in a refrigerated truck, in a refrigerated trailer at cooler temperatures. As we increase those temperatures, we decrease the quality of the seedlings. We also really don't want any wind. We don't want to dry out those root systems. It doesn't take much. So our goal is to protect those seedlings. So the vehicles that we like to use in transportation of seedlings to a staging area would be refrigerated trucks or trailers as an ideal scenario, or covered trucks, you know, a canopy or like a cooler box. It's like the one in the photo here that Nabil provided that just slides in the back of a pickup. But what you don't want to do is drive down the road like you see in the bottom photo here with seedlings in the back of the truck. You got solar radiation just penetrating onto those boxes. You got the wind, and you're going to start chipping away at that seedling quality in that checkbook analogy. Another option too is if it's warm and you got a covered truck, you can drive at night. We've done that many times over long distances to minimize the stress to the seedling. So in terms of on-site storage, again, you know, if there's an opportunity to use a reefer truck or a walk-in cooler, that would be great at the base camp. But when we get to the field site, you know, we're going to be a bit more limited in what we can do. And so it's usually more of a passive system. And we really have to protect ourselves from those temperatures, from exposure to the sun and exposure to the wind. And in this graph right here, you can see with the yellow line, that is a no cover. So that's basically seedlings sitting out in the sun, and our temperatures are extremely high. And that will degrade the quality of the seedling pretty quickly. You put a canvas cover on top of it, and that's like a thermal blanket, and we're actually creating a bigger problem. So not an ideal scenario. What we found is space blankets and heavy shade work really well, but it's also important to kind of protect them from the wind as well. And so another concern that we have is for those seedlings to dry out. And it's, you know, good to kind of monitor that along the way. The graph that we have here on the right shows the plug water content, where we go from right to left. As it decreases, you're going to see a significant increase in mortality. So there may be a need for us to dip or irrigate those seedlings just prior to outplanting. I think it's going to be a lot easier for us to increase that water content of the seedling, you know, at the loading area versus that of actually in the field. And then, you know, another big concern is just the mechanical stresses that can happen with those seedlings, especially with the planting bag. So you don't want to overpack those planting bags. These are very fragile organisms, and it doesn't take much. If you look at the graph to the right, the control, if you look at the green bars, the control on the left, pretty large. But if you look in the middle, we have seedlings that have been dropped from a height of about 1.5 feet, and we see a decrease in volume growth of about 50%. Another thing that we can do when we're handling those seedlings in the field is use a reflective tarp or a space blanket for the tree planters. if necessary. So I want to move on to planting techniques and especially planting tools. And I know Jeremy was talking about the target plants, concept about matching the seedling to the site. And so working backwards, if we're matching the seedling to the site, well, then we need to match the tool to the seedling to the site, right? And so for us, the ideal planting bar that we've been using here in the Southwest is the Jim KBC dibble bar. And it works really well because when we think about the planting method, ultimately our goal is to minimize soil disturbance. And, we were supposed to do this in person and do some demonstrations up on the hill to kind of talk about planting methods and techniques. So we'll use the figure as the proxy for that right now. But, the idea is we're basically putting in the dibble bar, you're prying open the soil, you're sliding in this container, the seedling, and you're closing up that hole. We are not pulling out soil and letting it sit out and being exposed to the sun, wind, and drying out. And I've seen that a lot with the hodad. The hodad works really well in good, soils, buttery soils of, the Oregon Western mountains. But here we're in the Rocky Mountains, and there's a reason why they call them the Rocky Mountains. So the Jim bar has been proven to be very effective in the work that we do, especially with the seedlings that we use. In terms of other planting techniques, we have microsite selection. For example, we can be looking at placing seedlings on the north side of logs, north side of stumps, north side of snags, and even in some cases on the north side of vegetation, so long as it's not going to be extremely competitive with the seedling being planted. Very important would be the installation of animal protection. Again, elk and deer tend to dominate what happens with our reforestation programs. And so we use a variety of different techniques, but here in the Southwest, we've been using the Vexar tubes, the bottom left, most commonly, but you've got a whole other slew of options, which can, we need to probably do some more research on, but you've got bud caps and these big, large tree tubes on the right. And this pocket gopher guy keeps showing up, but that is because they are problematic. And so at the time of planting, if we're seeing a lot of activity, again, it's important to consider trapping. So planting inspections are performed during the planting operation. And some of the things that we're looking at here are planting density, microsites, planting quality, making sure that, I think Jeremy showed a slide of a J-rooted seedling being planted. I think that was number 5 here on this figure. And shelter quality, making sure the shelters are installed properly. And it's important to do this throughout the planting operation because it's likely you're going to see some mistakes along the way. And you want to make sure that you can make those adjustments with the planting crew before it becomes too problematic. So next up, we have our post-planting activities. And first, we have our monitoring and data collection. And so in terms of the timeline for monitoring, it really begins at the time of planting. We should be putting in our first plots at the time of planting, and this can be incorporated into the inspections if necessary. And our second measurement should be after the first growing season, and then continue as often as possible. I know that the Forest Service will do it after the first growing season and after the third growing season. And the data to be collected is really important. Survival is obvious, but we need to also get some other characteristics of what's going on in terms of growth, for example, height and/or diameter, and also damage. Is there frost damage? Is there animal damage? And then I think it's also important for us to note all of that information about the planting, the seed source, the nursery that it was grown in, the stock type, the date, and those other things. And I do want to point out that the method that we collect this data is extremely important. And so ideally, we're trying to, just maximize the value of that data. So we want really strong, statistically valid data. Fixed plots are the best, but they just take a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy and resources to put those in. Transects work quite well as fixed plots and just maybe a little bit more cumbersome for the analysis. And stake rows have a lot of limitations, and you know, I question some of the value that the data that it generates, and that data is really important. And the reason why is that data allows us to assess the performance of those seedlings, and then help us refine the process within that whole target plant concept. So if we're seeing failures and we have good data, we may realize that it's a part of the nursery conditioning process, or that it's a seed source issue. And so, you know, if for us to continue to improve our reforestation efforts, we need good data. And based on what we're doing in terms of monitoring, we can also do some post-planting silvicultural treatments. For example, we can do release treatments with continued vegetation control. We may need to adjust and or add tree protection. And this guy keeps popping up everywhere, but trapping is, you know, a potential necessity, because I have seen them wipe out so many plots. And you may need to fertilize. It depends on the soil, and that might be part of the site evaluation. But overall, it's really critical to apply a lot of these post-planting silvicultural treatments within the first 3 years when the seedling is most vulnerable. And it may be based on our monitoring and potential failures in our silvicultural treatments. It may be necessary to replant. And that might be to meet certain objectives, such as stocking levels. I think it's important to determine what factors contributed to that failure. We can adjust our plan using those limiting factors. And then we can start the whole process over. I mean, start with the site evaluation, planning, nursery production, etc. And then we go back through and do the entire seedling assessment performance and refine the process. And ultimately, and you've seen this slide before from the nursery side, but it works very well with our outplanting side too, is we're trying to create that positive seedling feedback loop. And our goal is to minimize disruption. So for example, if we're seeing animal browse on the shoot, we're decreasing photosynthesis, which then translates to a reduction in new root growth. And another example is if we're driving those seedlings down the highway and we're drying out the roots, and we lose the ability to, you know, move water from the roots to the shoot, well, then we're not putting on new shoots and decreasing photosynthesis. So if we can minimize our disruption, we can have continued growth and survival. And then we finally get to the point where we are free to grow and we have success.
Great. Well, thanks so much to Josh, Jeremy, Owen for covering a tremendous amount of material and a short amount of time. And so I'm just gonna sort of put a bow on some of what they've done just by pointing to some folks to some additional resources that have come up during the talks. And I, like Jeremy, with Reforestation Nurseries and Genetic Resources, we refer to it as Ringer, and we will respond to Ranger as well. At this point in time, with the Forest Service, I think it's really important that people see names, associate those with faces. And that's part of what I'm going to do here. Some really good resources out there for you. And the Ringer website, which was already mentioned, I'll show again. It's all about seed and seedling production, reforestation and restoration. How to store seed is increasingly important. Josh talked about assistant migration, and it's really nice to, as a Ringer member, to be able to participate in trainings like this. So this is sort of an overview of the team, and I'm going to go through some of the key folks here that might be relevant to people in the Southwest. And let's start off here. Earlier, Josh was mentioning that there are Forest Service nurseries that you might want to contact as a resource. And one of the things I would encourage you to do is, although these people are technically Washington office based, these were all nursery managers. In Sarah and Lindsay's case, nursery managers, and Kayla managed the band seed extractory for many years. So they'd be a really good place to go to. They would either be able to answer your questions or know which nursery to guide you to. Sarah is also she does a lot of our grant work and grant coordination. So she's a good person to tie with that. For more information about these folks and for ones that I don't cover, if you go to the Ringer website and you go to About and Personnel, you can learn more. If you don't know who Jeremy was, then shame on you. Just a treasure, and it was great. It was amazing how much material he was able to synthesize so clearly earlier in the day. Paul Rhodes is new to the team as the National Nursery Pest Specialist. He's an entomologist by training. He's on this call. Like a lot of entomologists, he dabbles extensively in pathology. He is based out of Region 3, like Jeremy, even though he's over in Athens, Georgia. He was mentioning he has knowledge not just of nursery and seed orchard pests, but also early silviculture pests that you might come across, like pine tit moth. Great resource to have. Also want to highlight Emily, who we saw briefly on the screen earlier. Prior to being the Southern Nursery Specialist, she was a longtime container grower. There she is, hey Emily. Longtime container grower at Coeur d'Alene Nursery, and has grown many millions of seedlings for the Intermountain West, including down into the Southwest. So while her title is Southern Nursery Specialist, she has a wealth of knowledge on Intermountain container growing as well. Myself, I service the Western regions here. I'll put my contact information at the end, as well as a personal email. And then finishing up here, I always chuckle at Matt. He looks so visionary in that photo, but like he's back to run for president or something. Anyway, Andrea Watts is the editor of Tree Planters Notes. And that is a trade journal that if you're that I highly recommend subscribing to. You can get it either online, in person, or both. So if you haven't written it down yet, ringer.net is this great resource. The website is there's a lot of information on there. Someone described it as a labyrinth. It's good to just take some time to navigate around there. One of the things I'm going to be showing is under publications, some of the manuals that have already been discussed, but there's a whole bunch of resources on there that you can find. The Woody Plant Seed Manual was described a fair amount earlier with a lot of enthusiasm for that. What we call the Tribal Nursery Manual, or Nursery Manual for Native Plants, is a great synthesis of a lot of other manuals. It's particularly used and enjoyed by restoration nursery growers. A lot of our information is sort of targeted more towards conifer production or hardwoods in the South. It's a fantastic resource as well. Okay, here's a little advertisement for Tree Planters Notes. It's celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, which is impressive. One of the best things about it is that it not only hits this core audience here, tree planters, but it is a lot of articles produced by practitioners for practitioners. No knock on academic journals, whatever, but sometimes you just want stuff produced by people who are actually living it day to day. Really encourage that every silviculturist on the call have this manual. It's volume 7, came out I think in 2011. A lot of information is still very current. And you'll notice that some of the illustrations from the talks were drawn from this manual. One thing that we don't have is a Southwest specific manual. Emily and I were talking earlier, there's this great manual from back in the 90s called Care and Planting of Southern Pines, which has some hilarious illustrations in it as well. The needs of the Southwest are unique. It's not California, it's not the Northwest or the South. Monsoon planting. Part of the goal of this workshop is to help develop information towards a Southwest specific manual. And really, when you think about it, reforestation, restoration planning in the Southwest is probably the most challenging reforestation restoration that one can do, especially if you are ignoring some of the biological considerations that were brought up earlier in the talks. Some tribal folks on the call as well here, and want to call out that nursery manual again. Jeremy Pinto, invaluable resource in terms of on-site consultation. If you're a tribal representative who's on this, you probably know Jeremy already, but use him. And Jeremy puts on an intertribal nursery council meeting that sort of rotates around North America. In addition to that, we have regional meetings that we put on, one in the West, and then there's one that sort of rotates between the Northeast and the South. Now, for this audience, I will say that the ones in the West tend to be either in the Pacific Northwest or the Intermountain Northwest up by Idaho. There is a gap and a need for Southwest specific pipeline training. So it's wonderful that this is taking place, and really looking forward to follow-on trainings and things like that take place. It has been a gap. So with that, just want to note that if you want to get a hold of me, probably I don't have USDA access and not sure if I will going forward. So nabilkaderi@gmail.com.